Tuesday this week, Victorian Treasurer Pallas handed down the state budget off the back of a pandemic that has left Victoria in near economic ruin. In an election year for Victorians, Pallas has delivered what appears to be a big spending budget focused on hope and best case scenarios rather than fact and reality, with the expectation it will be funded by the federal government. Now, Emma Dawson is a leading economist and founder of the progressive think tank Per Capita, and she joins us today to give her thoughts on the Victorian state budget and whether it's a magic pudding that will give Andrews what he wants. Morning, Emma.
Hi, Michael. Good to be with you.
Now, the state budget, firstly, one of the things that struck me was the 13 pages dedicated to pointing out how hard done by Victorians were done by the federal government. To me, that struck me a little bit like a child complaining about their allowance. And I'm not trying to be derogative, but you're given an amount. The amount was known, and how you spend it was up to you. The states have shown that they have a lot of autonomy through COVID, and they wanted to express it. And now suddenly that seems to have been flipped in this budget.
Look, I think it's states complaining about their carve-up share of federal funding is nothing new, right? Western Australia's made an art form out of it. And I think Victoria there's some justification for being a little peeved about the distribution, particularly of infrastructure spending towards our state. You know, we're the second most populous state, and we're on track to overtake Sydney as the biggest city in Australia. And certainly the Andrews government has thrown a lot of money at infrastructure, and they're pretty peeved that they're not getting what they see as their fair share from the feds. This is one of the challenges of our federation, right? The states can't raise many taxes. The states can't directly raise income tax. So they rely on income from the GST, which is determined by pretty complicated arithmetic. And on those taxes, they can raise like payroll tax and stamp duty and so on. They've done pretty well out of stamp duty over the last 12 months with the increase in house prices. But yeah, this constant refrain of who's getting what, it's not fair, it's a perennial battle between the states and the federal government. But I do think there's some justification, and it's felt quite strongly in the community that Victoria wasn't particularly well supported over the last 2 years by the feds. And that's certainly, as you say, coming out strongly in this budget.
Now, the budget, it hasn't been well received by the rating agencies. I've seen Moody's and S&P have said that they don't think that, and again, a lot of it's not to do with Victoria per se, but the economic environment worldwide. They think interest rates and costs are going to do it. I see in the budget, there was a 5.5% increase allocated for public sector spending. Well, it's 1.3% a year, and we've got an inflation rate currently at 5%. We've started to see some industrial unrest with teachers and nurses happening interstate. It's fairly unrealistic, and the figures going in determine the figures coming out. Are those figures going in realistic?
Look, if we're talking really about public sector pay cap, so there's a pay cap in place in public sector workers in Victoria of 1.5%, and you're quite right, inflation's at 5.1%. That's a real pay cut of 3.6% over the year. Now, the Treasurer, Pallas, has said, look, we might review that pay cap. And I think that's an indication that he's already aware that it's not going to fly. People can't be going backwards at that rate in this economic environment, particularly with interest rates already now rising for the first time in 11 years. As you say, a lot of those pressures are external to the state, and I think what this government's doing, and let's mention the elephant in the room, it's an election year in Victoria, so this is an election budget, right? What they're doing is front-loading the debt now while money's still relatively cheap, and trying to get as much of it out into the economy as quickly as they can in a way that will produce growth, so that even though they forecast pretty eye-watering staggering level of debt, 26.5% of state domestic product by 25-26. That's a lot of debt for a state to carry. But they're also building a surplus in that time. So if you look at the projections, they're expecting to build a $650 million operating surplus, 5.5 billion cash surplus by 25-26 as well. So the numbers are big, but they do balance out. And if you look at what reassures me, certainly with my focus on the economics of productivity and social infrastructure, they are, to me, investing most of that spending or most of that borrowing in services and jobs and infrastructure that will build a return. But certainly the public sector, one of the challenges here is there's a lot of money in the budget for more nurses and more teachers, but not any accommodation for lifting those wages to meet the cost of living. And that's going to be the real challenge over the short to medium term. So it'll be interesting to see when the Treasurer says, look, we might review that pay cap, what that will mean, not just for the workforce, because the government's the biggest employer in Victoria, but also for the state budget's coffers. So they're going to bring on 1,900 new teachers, heaps of new nurses, new AMBOs, 90 new AMBOs, 400 workers at the 000 call centre. If all of those people, all of those workers then on top of the existing workforce need a further pay rise as well, that is going to blow the Treasurer's numbers out.
Now, we've also seen within those nurses, they're saying that they'll bring in 2,000 from overseas, because Victoria, we saw an actual net loss in population. More people moved out of the state than moved in. I think we're the only state to suffer that. Have we stopped that? Will that flow go on and then again affect the predictions that they've got within that budget because less tax coming in from less people?
So I think one of the reasons Victoria lost population during the pandemic, yes, there was certainly an impact of some internal migration, people leaving the state, but it was primarily because our population was so heavily influenced, so heavily propped up by international students and temporary visa holders who went home. It's essential to bring in nurses from overseas. The care economy, the care sector very much relies on overseas nurses and health workers and care workers. And I don't think there's any danger that those people won't want to come to Australia. The challenge is ensuring, and this is where the state needs to cooperate with the federal government, is ensuring that they have a decent prospect of secure work and a secure immigration visa when they get here and they can build a life. But it's absolutely imperative that we bring that workforce in. We also need to train, offer more training places, and the government's talking about doing that as well. Big investment in education over the last few years, so that we train up local people and make nursing and teaching an attractive proposition for young Victorians, but we will always rely on as well in bringing in skilled workers particularly in the health and care sectors.
Now, one of the features of the budget, one of the transformative things for the Victorian state government was the announcement of the Future Fund to be partially paid for by part privatisation of the Vic roads and the licensing fees. Now, they're saying that the interest or the money earned from that Future Fund will help offset some of the costs. There's no such thing as a safe investment. A guaranteed investment, is there? And given the state of the world economy and all of the things going into influencing that, from the war to possible re-emergence of some new strain that could see us, can this money be counted on? Is it a risk, or is it a risk worth taking?
I think it's a risk worth taking. I'm not a fan of privatising public services. Let's start with that. So the way this is being funded is not ideal in my view, but it's very difficult, as I said, for state governments to raise revenue of that magnitude any other way. Future funds are usually quite a secure, so we're talking about sovereign wealth funds, effectively. They have various different names. In Australia, we call the federal one a future fund, and that's really what the government's trying to do down here. They are a relatively safe investment vehicle. They can diversify their investments pretty well. Our future fund operates well ahead of the standard market returns, and that's pretty common for sovereign wealth funds internationally. What the government's trying to do here is is shore up some future revenue base so that it's not as reliant on that argument with the federal government all the time and on those state breakdowns. I think it is quite forward thinking. But as I said, I'm not a fan of privatising public services to set it up. If in an ideal world, we fund things like future funds and sovereign wealth funds by taxing rents, by taxing, the extraction of resources from our land, and no level of government's very good at doing that.
Yeah. Now, two of the biggest sources of income for the state are our land tax and properties.
Yes.
The downturn in the market, given that one of the biggest things, and again, I'm going to refer to your expertise and not my layman at best knowledge, encouraging people into the market with the federal government's 10,000 places where we own part of it. Aren't most of our problems on the supply side? Won't this exacerbate things? And over the years, everything we've done to encourage Australians into homes, the pejorative language, the great Australian dream, all of this push into it, haven't we actually caused I think it's up around 580% increase over the last, since 1980 compared to 60% for the rest of the world? Mm-hmm. Is this a good idea to be encouraging people into the market at a time when the market just can't bear the extra?
Probably not. I mean, Per Capita put out a big report on housing affordability earlier this week, and we looked at all influences on property prices, and not just house prices to purchase, but also rents, social housing, the full gamut. There are both supply and demand influences that are pushing prices up, but certainly the demand side policies, tax concessions, negative gearing, capital gains tax discount, etc., have had a huge influence on pushing up house prices. And at the same time, we do have a lack of supply of the houses, the kinds of houses we need for the families that want them. So we've had a very developer-led approach to supply, and also restrictions that prevent us by building, medium density housing in inner and middle suburbs that are within an easy commute for people's jobs. We have made a mess of housing in this country. We've turned it into effectively a commodity, an investment vehicle rather than a home. And all levels of government are going to have to tackle that problem at some point. We found with our research that we're on track for anyone born after 1990. Their rate of home ownership will be about 55% compared to 72%, which is the historical high in the 1960s. So we are reducing the ability of young people to get into the market. And I think some of the policies in place, yes, certainly first home buyers grants and other policies over the years that have been supposed to help people have actually been inflationary in terms of putting up housing prices. The federal opposition's current election policy for shared equity scheme is something that shouldn't be necessary in a well-functioning market. They're effectively saying, well, if you don't have the bank of mum and dad to help you with your deposit, the government will be the bank of mum and dad. We'll take 30 or 40% equity stake. You can buy it back over time, or we'll take that back when we sell. That's effectively stumping up to be the bank of mum and dad for people that don't have wealthy parents. We shouldn't be in the position where if you don't have wealthy parents, you can't afford to buy an ordinary home in a wealthy country simply by working hard and saving. That's the Australian dream, and we've done a lot to kill it. It's not too late. We can bring it back, but we've made a mess of it.
Well, and again, I'm going to draw on your expertise as a leading economist and the wonderful reputation that Per Capita has. I can't quite find the mechanism by which Clive Palmer is guaranteeing 3% home loans. Could you explain that to a numbnuts like me?
No, I can't, Michael. I don't know anyone who understands how Clive thinks he's going to do that, unless he's going to nationalise the banks, which I don't think is part of his policy. So no, in a market system with our independent banking system, he really has no realistic prospect of doing that unless he wants to renationalise the Commonwealth Bank.
So we can pretty much put a line through that as reasons. There may be other reasons to vote for him, which I'm unaware of, but to his supporters, if that's in your top three, we can according to Emma Dawson, leading economist, per capita, we can put a line through that one. Now, the Victorian government, as well as nearly every government around the world, the budget was aimed at rebuild and repair. Do you think that the budget is going to be capable of it? The 167 million excess that deficit that we're looking at in 4 years, we've predicted a surplus again of some 600 and something million coming.
Yeah.
There are so many moving parts to this that could see it come unstuck.
Always. There always are. But budget forecasts are an art, not a science. So it's, events happen and things get thrown out of whack. All any treasurer can do at budget time is produce a set of numbers that adds up at that time. And then you have to deal with what comes at you. But I think, as I said at the start, the big central focus of this budget is public health. There's $12 billion there for public health. There's a $900 million for a new hospital in Melton. There's $500 million to expand the Barwon Women's and Children's Hospital, more 000 workers, more AMBOs, more nurses, and money for COVID response. And I think 1.3 billion to implement the recommendations of the mental health inquiry. These are things that people want. And if you look at where the money's going, it's going to those areas where we saw during COVID, they don't have adequate facilities. They don't have enough hospital places in the outer suburbs. They don't have enough public health sector workers. Wait times, we've seen horrible stories of people dying waiting for an ambulance because they can't get through to 000 or there aren't enough ambulances. These are the basic things that people expect governments to provide. So I think that while the numbers, anything can happen to the numbers, the question is, can we afford not to do this? Can we afford not to have adequate public health in place, particularly in those growth corridors where we're encouraging people to emigrate and to come to Victoria, move to Victoria from overseas, work in our economy, fill those essential jobs, but then we're not giving them the essential services. And we saw that play out during the pandemic really strongly. It was very much postcode, where you lived dictated how much access you had to those essential services. So it's good investment. It's good spending. It's not reckless spending. Similarly, the schools, upgrading schools and 1,900 new teachers. No one would, with a kid, would argue that that's needed. So I think, yes, it's big spending, but they will have huge returns. Supporting the health of the population, ensuring people have access to services when they need them, and education is the most productive investment you can make.
Great. All right. To finish with, Emma, I'm going to put you on the spot. Number 10 being the magic pudding, number 1 being the roadmap. So the magic pudding is a carrot. Where would you place this budget along the scale from 1 to 10? Magic pudding 10, roadmap number 1.
I'd give it a solid 3 or 4. It is definitely an election budget. You look at where they're targeting the money. It's to fix a lot of problems that they've been called out on over the last few years, underinvestment in public health, underinvestment in those outer metropolitan regional communities, a lot of focus on the regions, Commonwealth Games coming to the regions, lots of infrastructure. So definitely an election budget. But because it is spending in the areas that we've clearly seen we need to invest in, I'd give it more favourable count than just saying it's a magic pudding and it's never going to happen. I think there's some big numbers, but there's some good investment there too.
Great. All right, Emma Dawson from Per Capita, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Michael. Great to talk to you.